So Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Quick plug, Education in a Time Between Worlds. I'll put it in the show notes. If you're interested in education, the future, technology, society, and just really informative essays, definitely get a copy of it because it's been blowing my mind. And nice. Yeah, I suppose so. To start off with, like, it's something I talk about a lot on this because I've been in the education system for 23 years or whatever else, and I think a lot of people share my perception that it's not fitting the bill. It's not kind of, the world's changing too quickly. There's too much going on. If you could even give just a quick summary of what you think what the issue with the education system is in the 21st century, just for people who are joining us.
That's a huge question, right? There are many issues.
Yeah.
When people say that, when they say there's issues with the educational system, usually what they mean is more specifically school systems. And so that's the place I usually begin these conversations, is say there are school systems and then there's education. And education is a broader social function that includes the media and museums and presidential speeches and even certain laws that affect human capacity. So I would say both are in crisis, both the schools and the broader educational commons, I would call it, of institutions that shape people, even though they're not schools, and provide places where education takes place, like a museum or, again, like a media outlet. And so the schools, in particular, I diagnose in the book and speak to what I would summarize now in a slightly different language, patterns where you invest in a certain way of solving a problem, let's say standardized testing. And taking that approach to solving the problem makes the problem worse. And this is a common pattern that occurs in institutions when they've passed their prime. And this guy, Tainter, he made a model of civilizational collapse, and it talks about diminishing returns on investment in complexity, where you build an institution and you invest a little bit and you create a little bit of complexity and it solves huge problems. And then you, like our public school systems after World War II, were an incredible innovation, changed the world. And we can talk about when schools were working. And even when the Fourth Estate, to go broader, when the Fourth Estate, the press.
Yeah, that's kind of the other aspect of education.
Exactly. But now we're into a situation where neither of those.
I was going to say that both of them are malfunctioning.
And so with the standardized testing in the United States, at least, No Child Left Behind, and then Obama's race to the top and other policies where we were using testing to solve a problem. It was actually making the problem worse, but we couldn't detect that it was making the problem worse. So it was like this vicious feedback loop. And so we have, in a major way, kind of failed with our largest scale educational institutions, the large urban school districts, I would say, in the United States, in part testing, but also largely from a devaluation of teaching and learning.
Well, that's something that you... Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yep. No, please.
That you touch on that really struck me in the book, which isn't really spoken about, but is definitely pervasive, is teacherly authority and the issue around the kind of bureaucratic structures of schools, whereby teacherly authority is kind of, you're in the system, so that's why you have to kind of respect the teacherly authority, as opposed to, I don't know if you'd agree with this categorization, but it came across to me as something like respect and best good intention meeting kind of competence. It reminded me of martial arts, because I do a lot of martial arts, and your instructor in martial arts is a much more of that kind of relationship. It's not like a bureaucratic kind of thing. And yeah, I guess how do we, it's again a massive question that's probably too, but how do we start to transition to where teacherly authority, what's going to be the new home of teacherly authority? Is there, and how does that connect?
That's a great question. Yeah. And the dojo is an interesting example, right? I don't know if that's the right term given your martial art, but the sense being that, like, there's non-institutionalized teacherly authority, right? And then there's institutionalized, bureaucratized teacherly authority, which is what most people associate with teaching. And so again, we reduce education and teaching to schooling, when in fact those are broader categories. And so like parenting, for example, is a case of non-institutionalized teacherly authority. Like, teachable moments come up. The parent is the primary effect, especially in early childhood of education. And so that sense that there's a responsibility to understand the dynamics of non-institutionalized teacherly authority, and to get the proxy for that, which is bureaucratized teacherly authority. If that starts to degrade, the suspicion of teacherly authority in general seeps throughout the culture, and it gets hard to actually have reasonable conversations in non-institutionalized contexts where teacherly authority needs to be wielded. But karate or martial arts,
that's what I was going to say,
or fixing a car or outward bound type stuff, where there's an obviously demonstrable differential incapacity to solve an issue that both parties are interested in solving. And so you have what I call an epistemic asymmetry. Right? You know more than me. We both know that. We both want me to learn more. And we're both interested in actually obsoleting that relationship of asymmetry, which is to say, like, the good teacher wants the student to actually understand what they know and to surpass them. Because ultimately it's about intergenerational transmission of key skills and capacities. So in that sense, understanding those dynamics of like, well, how do you know when there's a situation of legitimate, non-institutionalized teacherly authority? And what does that feel like? It's a key question, because right now many people are getting a bad taste for learning and the dynamics of teaching and learning, because they're just collapsing those to what happens in schools and not realizing that every time they're on YouTube or engaging with a media environment or talking to an elder or even talking to a peer who has different experiences, there are opportunities to see teacherly authority, both legitimate and illegitimate, false prophets and disinformation and a whole bunch of other stuff prey upon this instinct for teacherly authority.
That's exactly the thread I wanted to pick up on as well, which is bringing in the informational technologies. It's something that you touch on also in the book, which is the kind of the spiritual mentor, I suppose, that's coming about in digital spaces a lot, and that there's the kind of, I don't know if you call it guru culture or whatever, but people looking for this teacherly authority, and how the informational spaces, particularly on social media and things like that, you end up with influencers, and you get it's kind of a fishy area for teacherly authority. It's a strange kind of, because there is that asymmetry of information or asymmetry of knowledge. But how is the asymmetry of knowledge when it comes to life and, say, philosophy and really ethics, how to live, how should you live? That question is being addressed informationally. Would you say that there is room for intervention or algorithmic kind of influence on that? I don't know because then authority becomes conflated with success on the site, I suppose. I don't know what to think about that. The first point to make is that this category of teacherly authority, like in the domain, as we were talking about, of martial arts or auto mechanic, skill, it's like you can tell in that context, like I said, obviously demonstrable differential incapacity. So like both people are like, well, totally, I have no idea how to fix that car, you know how to fix the car. In these other domains, which are very important culturally, these domains of religious and spiritual teacherly authority, which humans have always had since time immemorial. We've always had both technical teacherly authority and spiritual worldview disseminating, religious practice influencing teacherly authority. And so, but how do you demonstrate, right? Now, prior cultures there were tests. If someone's willing to only meditate basically all day in a cold place up in the mountains, never have sex, eat not that much food, right? Study all day, argue with dudes about abstract questions. That's all they do. Yeah, they do that for 30 years. You know what I'm saying? Like, a lot of respect.
Okay, like, let me listen to you, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just saying, and then you're a young person, you did ayahuasca a couple times, you had some powerful experiences, but you need to make money doing something that's not going to destroy your soul. So you get up and into kind of an advertisement based attention capture model of building a guru brand around this need for spiritual teacherly authority. So that's called a false prophet. It usually does not end well. But the culture lacks the ability to make some of those distinctions because of the nature of the tools at people's disposal. So you can keep yourself out of a situation of having to actually walk the talk of claiming to have more advanced spiritual teacherly authority. Whereas in other contexts, when you have a strong tradition, let's say a monastic tradition,
Yep.
it's like, okay, man, you can talk that way, but let's actually do the work of living together in monastic contexts. And how strong is your ethic then after 6 months, 9 months, 3 years, 5 years, right? And so deep commitment, not superficial commitment, and the ability to exercise moral conscience in contexts that actually matter. And so, yeah, what you're pointing to is a kind of predatory instinct that the information environment allows to seep into these places where there should be a lot more kind of, for lack of a better phrase, integrity and purity in the transmission of these important, these key concepts. So, of like worldview and
particularly because of the issues around scalability, I think. I mean, there's just never been such an opportunity to just pump out nonsense to people en masse. But something interesting that I'm hearing you say in there is that the lack of an ethical framework in our society makes it very difficult to qualitatively distinguish between these teachers.
Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like the absence of those rituals and kind of thresholds and gateways of capacity that were recognized in prior cultures, and so in the absence of that, it's very difficult to get a sense of what's this person worth in terms of their claim to, have legitimate teacherly authority in this domain. And again, and in this domain being a religious, spiritual domain, which is arguably the most important domains that humans operate on. Once we figured out how to feed ourselves and other things, it's like we worry, what is life actually about? What makes me a good or bad person? How do I, move towards improving myself and helping? What does it even mean to help? So I think you're seeing it as a very important problem.
Well, yeah, the issue, it was something that really stuck out to me about your work that just drove home to me completely, that like something which I generally felt and experienced, I suppose, growing up secular and going through a kind of secular education system is, where is the ethical education? Where does it fit in a secular society? For me, it actually came from martial arts. It came from a foundation of, in ninjutsu, there's kind of an ethical philosophy, which is questionable at times because it involves like assassinations and stuff. So I don't know if that's applicable, but, it's kind of, it fascinates me because I think a lot of the wokeness and the issues with like, the polarization and stuff, also the tribalism, is because of the ethical confusion, the need for a person to tell you right from wrong, because we don't have any kind of institution doing it appropriately.
Yeah. Well, and again, back to, the schools, the modern state, the separation of church from state, the whole idea and the whole actually advancement, if you will, of the public school was that it was secular. And, but what it did was it relied upon these other dimensions of education taking place in the home, around the dinner table and at church on Sunday, right? And there's always been this little through line in critical theory about modernity, that modernity actually relied upon the pre-modern remnants of the religious traditions to support its people. And so you separate church and state and you say, okay, we do that, but there needs to be in an actual thriving religious and ethical culture in the country. And so the founding fathers in the United States were very explicit about that. They were essentially saying, you need a free press, and highly educated and actively religious, which means having answers to those questions of ultimate concern, let's say. And in the absence of that, and in the failure of educational systems more broadly, even to distribute competence in technical areas, then you're really up a creek without a paddle, as it were. If you're trying to run the government democratically.
Trying to have a functioning democracy, which is another thread line, which is the threat of informational technologies to democracy. And something which I know, I don't know if you saw Daniel Schmachtenberger and Tristan Harris on Joe Rogan's podcast recently. They actually mentioned your work on it as well. And they were all the research I've done on social media, it's just like the evidence that it's damaging democracy is so overwhelmingly obvious and so pervasive, but so kind of impossible to deal, like, unless you switch it off. I mean, it really got me wondering, what are the technologies that would increase democracy? And then the point you're making about democracy, which is that it's this education, people have to be educated, they have to have some sort of ethical foundation, and they have to be engaged. And what would the technology be like? How would it have to change to do that?
Right. And that's the way to go. And we can have people go watch that podcast of Joe Rogan's if you want the critique, right? And one of the concerns is, well, how the hell did we get out of this? So
yeah, it was.
Right, there it is. It's like, what the hell?
What's the way
It's
out?
frightening. It's frightening because, just to be a little frightening for a little bit longer, and then we'll talk about where to go. But so we talk about the gurus, the people making themselves into gurus. Imagine artificial intelligences making themselves into gurus.
I think that's already happening, to be honest.
I think it's basically inevitable. Yeah.
More than we think. A lot of people like Stuart Russell, one of the guy who wrote the book on AI, talks about the social media algorithms that, like, it's basically incentivized it to make people addicted. That's the equivalent of success. So if it adapts and gets better, it makes people more addicted. And, who's pulling the strings, really? But yeah, sorry, I came across it.
Yeah, no. Then that's the point to make, is that, like, we don't know what is happening when we're staring at our screen and scrolling through our various news feeds across social media and even mainstream media at this point, because of the attention capture, kind of what Zuboff would call surveillance capitalism dynamics at the heart of the business model, basically, behind big tech. And so one thing to think about is, there's many things to think about here, but one thing to think about is the objective functions of the algorithm of Facebook, right? Which is to say, what do these things do? And right now, we don't. First of all, they're secret, so we don't know.
Yes, no transparency. So
that's
not sure.
Not there. But one can assume that the dominant thrust of what was behind the design parameters for this algorithm is basically profit for Facebook through these really well specified dynamics of basically addiction and attention capture, and the taking off of the surplus behavior, basically data, and selling that data. And so we know that whole rigmarole. What's interesting is that we've never actually incentivized the algorithmic curation of content in terms of education.
This is
like
exactly what I was trying to get to. Was as terrifying as me learning about the social media algorithms was, and the amount of damage it's done, I thought, what if you turned it a couple of degrees to the left and had a theory of human development, and that was somehow the objective of it? If it could be curated, not to just sell you stuff and keep you engaged, but to keep you developing, to keep you learning, and like tailor-made, personalized education at a reasonable price of free.
Correct. But it's what it's important to get here is, like, that's way less profitable. Because you would need public, you'd need to make public the objective functions of the algorithm, and you would need to have some form of public support for what is basically an educational infrastructure that supports the human development of everyone. And so just like we're using psychology now, we being like the technologists who are building Facebook, just like they are using the psychology now to make these things addictive, we could use different forms of psychology to make them educational. But they would do things like not force you, but tell you, hey, get the hell outside, get off your screen. Right? They would say, they would say, and this is one of in my book, I talk about, the true digital education isn't just screen-based.
Isn't there?
Video games or basically Khan Academy, which is basically TV on steroids. It is about time and skill sharing networks and a whole bunch of other capacities that actually allow people to be together in real time and space. So what I call like a pop-up classroom, right? So like an actually deep educational algorithm would have the concerns of the whole body and mind of the student. So it would be very concerned about how long have they been on the screen, how much learning is actually taking place, when's the last time they were in a group conversation about X, Y, Z. And they would be thinking that about all the students. And so it could easily create many opportunities for pop-up classrooms. And then if teachers and parents and other community members put in their skills, so time and skill sharing network, then you can reveal from the implicit relationships in the community all of the possible dynamics of teacherly authority that could be in play. Right?
Yep.
So this is like deep thinking about what would it look like to build a kind of social network and social media environment that was actually geared towards maximal educational benefit to each individual. And to be clear, this isn't about making sure everyone has their facts straight and facts checking the internet and getting everyone on the same page about everything, right? Because that's one way to say, well, the problem with the internet is the disinformation and all the stupid stuff spouted by people that I don't like and who, et cetera, et cetera. This is different. This is a structural redesign, which would actually have the potential to take someone in an irrational position, let's say captured by the technology now, put down a kind of rabbit hole of private groups and YouTube threads that get them deep into some crazy nook of conspiracy land. This thing we're talking about designing could rescue someone.
Could it undo that? And would it
undo that? Do you bring them up and out? Now it's very. So this is this is what. And the point is, I'm saying we've never incentivized people building this.
Yeah.
Like if all of the knowledge and power in Facebook was turned towards building this,
it's a
concern. Right. So, please.
But sorry. I mean, that just it's so. I mean, I thought it's very motivating. It seems to me to be. It's just like such a low cost kind of. I mean, I'm sure it would be expensive, but probably not the trillions that it costs to do Facebook. And as the technology gets better, I mean, do you think there's a Moore's law kind of thing that's inevitable, or that that would require, a sort of radical shift in our cultural framework? I mean, is this, is it a bottom up kind of thing? Is it a top down?
I mean, it is political. Yeah, it is very political. Education, according to a lot of social theory, like Habermasian and otherwise, it is one of the root deep codes of any civilization, and it's one of the most powerful things to tinker with. Education, not just schooling, but the whole array of institutions that repopulate the social field from the youth, give them capacities, and then take over. Right, that social regeneration or social autopoiesis function. Messing with that, so deeply political. And so there's a lot of reason to see the dynamics that are unfolding currently with doubling down on schooling and basically taking digital as a form of television, as I mentioned. Kind of like the incapacity to actually see what the digital could do to education. There's a political resistance to so fundamentally changing the nature of the social field by opening up conversation, basically.
And that kind of, that just touched on something that, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment. I work with a tech events company. So I've been speaking to people from companies that are working on like Metaverses, Web 3.0 stuff, not the Facebook Metaverse, but that there's this huge explosion of, I suppose, new frontier tech and Web 3.0 and things like that. And again, like that, there seems to be not a lack of imagination, because they're imagining lots of things, but a lack of imagination to use that for this particular purpose, which is the kind of the benefit of the strengthening the individual towards maturity. It all seems to be about video games or profit or some kind of, I don't know, like a social world where you go watch concerts or something. But I wonder if you had any thoughts on that, you know, that emerging field of technology, and if you saw any, I don't know, like the decentralized education idea, that there's something there maybe, because that kind of goes beyond the individual politics to a global kind of thing going on.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the metaverse and deep virtual reality and augmented reality versions of what we currently have. We can speak to that. I mean, that you can imagine nightmare scenarios, and I lay some of that out in the Consilience Project writing on information warfare. But as you're alluding to, there's like the potential for unprecedented educational technologies were they to be innovated in environments that had the right incentive structures that could have people actually not work towards something that's going to be maximally profitable for a return on the venture capital that gets the whole thing going, but something that would be maximally socially beneficial regardless of its ability to turn profit, which is what a lot of educational stuff looks like. Because it's a commons. It's an issue with the commons. Like, you can't do educational work thinking you're going to create profit, just like you can't care for the commons thinking you're going to create profit. It's something we all need that keeps society going. And so there's a way that there's a fundamental deep questioning that needs to take place about the environments in which technology innovation occur. And the kind of like flippant techno-capitalist optimism that one feels in these environments that are tinkering with foundational educational stuff, and they think disruption is a good thing, right? And
well, that's, I mean, it's so disruptive. I mean, the media environment that most people are growing up in at the moment is not conducive to mental health or any sort of, even just, you know, epistemology that makes sense. Like, there's just so many fragmented images of, you know, I've done some of that where you mess around with an algorithm, you try and kind of train it a certain way on TikTok to give you certain types of content, and then you can just look at things on fire all day, everywhere. And there's just there's no thought for the level of interference that has had on people's lives. And I suppose that's where the possibilities of regulation and what Daniel and Tristan Harris were talking about, that, you know, the authoritarian way or the possibility of a democratic technology, which is kind of what I'm messing around with here, I think. But the educational technologies that make possible futures for open societies. Yes.
Like right now, the technology suite we're working with in the United States it forecloses on futures for open societies. And the way China solved the problem as they speak to is super interesting, but also forecloses on futures for open
also
terrifying. Terrifying, and but they're seeing the issue, at least, and responding to it. Whereas we are kind of in a tailspin, basically. And so regulation is scary because, again, these are educational things. This is a commons issue. And so the people need to actually be involved in education, and it needs to be, like you were saying, distributed. But right now I see basically the issue as a predatory, polluting infrastructure of like a for-profit surveillance-based nudge machine. Like massive for-profit surveillance-based nudging machine for which they rent time to anyone who's willing to pay to basically have people systematically surveilled. And so for me, it's odd that it's not a clearer kind of moral issue, especially with children under 18, right? So instead of talking about customized and micro-targeted, if we use terms like programs of child surveillance and child manipulation. Like is what is actually occurring. This is a widely distributed system of low-grade child abuse for profit. At the adult levels, you have something that is capable of running interference between citizens and the sovereign countries in which they live. And so you have a for-profit company exercising more control over American citizens than the United States government can exercise over those citizens. Cases in point would be protests, both left and right, where laws are broken on the street based on, as far as I can tell, usually mostly predominantly just information yielded from social media and exchanges on social media. And it's clear the polarization dynamics that occur in social media and the way that those are profitable and et cetera. So at the adult level, you have actually a new technology that's been invented that is interfering with the sovereignty of the nation state itself.
100%.
And so at that level, it's a national security threat. It makes our way of life impossible. And it's just a small rogue group of technologists who are doing this, who now control the massive nudge machine. And so we're using that machine to protect the machine. Right. And so it's when you have an industry that is massively pollutive and exploitative, usually you don't see it because it's like, oh, it's mining in the third world and like oil spills somewhere far away, and we should regulate that stuff. But these are industries that are creating extractive and polluting in your mind and in the minds of the Congress people who are trying to regulate the industry itself. So you have the situation of kind of like a grave epistemological danger of who is in a situation that so the first step then ends up being psychoeducational, which is to say the kind of work that's done when you get somebody out of a cult.
Yeah, that's
Or
when
you get someone out of a condition,
decondition people. Like Yuval Noah Harari, I watched an interview with him that I thought was very interesting, that he talks about the 21st century as the age of hackable humans, whereby the skill of the future is just going to be a level of introspection that you are able to be aware of when your desires are being contrived or that your demand is being implanted. But I don't think we're aware of it, to be honest. I think it's the more I've looked at it, the more I've kind of recognized it. You can see the kind of pattern of dysfunction that has emerged because of it. And it's kind of irresistible. I don't know if you ever heard of Matthew Crawford's, distracting ourselves to death, or kind of, it's such like sugary food to people, or such like, it's so salient, but it's actually creating people's salience landscapes. So it's like the thing we'd use to get away from it is actually being manipulated towards it. And I don't know how. I mean, regulation for me has kind of made sense because I just don't see another option with Facebook really winding it down themselves or anything, or people stopping using it because it so creates the conditions for its own demand.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like I was saying, they have this massive surveillance-based nudge machine, or you could call it a brainwashing machine if you want to get more hyperbolic. But either way, they can obviously use that to protect the machine. And so that is a lot of what is occurring. But it's also the case that, at least there's government intervention now also already. And so the question of government regulation should also be asked in the same breath of government current use of. Because both political parties have bought access to the nudge machine, man. And they bought access to the brainwashing machine, and they find it very useful. And many of the conversations I've been in, people don't want to stop the nudge machine. They want to control the nudge machine. And they don't want to stop the culture war. They want to win and therefore end the culture war.
Yeah.
When we've already demonstrated that you can't actually do that. And so that's one thing to say. As you're talking about regulation, you have to realize that there are people who, it's like you're trying to stop the coke dealers in your city, but all the city, all the cops are doing coke. So it's like, what do we do? Right? This is a very similar situation. And so So that's the first bit, is that regulation's dicey also because the government would love to control information.
Well, that's the whole hate speech thing and everything like that. I'm like, Jesus Christ, I haven't even really dipped into that because it's just such an impossible, good luck trying to figure that one out. But just the multiplicity of issues that have kind of resulted from it. So one approach then is the regulation, but that has its own issues. Then the other approach will be this, the Web 3.0 decentralized web, whereby the central authorities have been taken away because of this risk factor, and perhaps that becoming a more popular model. I don't know if you've thought if that would be sane.
It's interesting because there's three levels of conversation, right? There's the diagnosing the current problem, which is key because there's a lot of stuff that you need to figure out what's going on.
Yep.
And then there's the logistics of what to actually do about it. But both of those are actually dependent upon a third conversation, which we're getting into, which is about this third attractor, which they mentioned probably on the Joe Rogan podcast, right? Which is what does the actual possible and preferable future look like? So I was talking about education-centric algorithms, right?
Yes.
So there's two things that need to happen. One is we need to have very explicit public conversations about other ways this technology that could be used, and to paint a picture of what the country could look like if we had a public infrastructure that was different. And then I think we need to invest, and this is the logistical question of what do we do. I don't think we simply regulate Facebook.
Yeah.
We could try, but again, they've got us, all right? I think what we need to do is invest in something different, something like the Manhattan Project mixed with the CCC, which is the Civilian Conservation Corps. So we need to find a way to publicly fund a distributed effort to build an education and civic infrastructure, which would then basically have people have a place to go away from Facebook that they know was healthy for them. And then Facebook, if it would either become obsolete or would have to adapt, or would have to just be what it is, which is like a weird kind of entertainment, where you get a simulation of reality and you live in a simulation of reality. And it's kind of like a massive multiplayer game, except it's in the real world. And that's what Facebook does. Right? But they're not a political news outlet or a public forum or the public sphere or civic society. It's like an entertainment simulation, virtual reality thing. That's cool, where we do the actual stuff of civic discourse and education. Oh, the government funded this distributed effort to build an education infrastructure, which we all participated in, and all the data is public, and it's taxpayer money that goes into it, and it has these specific design parameters. And that's where you go to think about complex political issues.
That's where the conversation is, rather than the social media world.
Yes, and it's also where you go to engage with the internet in a way that maximally benefits you in terms of your human development. But what do we mean by human development? Who answers that? Not the government.
Yeah, because there's
people answer that, and this is very important. Is that if you talk about regulating it, the reasonable reaction you get usually from the right is, well, you're just going to shut down all of the forums that are so important for freedom of speech about fringe issues. Right?
Yeah.
So what do you mean by human development? Because what I mean by human development is believing in Jesus eventually. Right?
Yes, and you can run into all these obstacles there.
Right. So it's very important for this type of infrastructure that the government doesn't top-down design. Hey, we answered the question of what human development's about, and here's your educational infrastructure.
That sounds horrifying.
They really fund very publicly in a very unprecedented way. It would be like having the Manhattan Project, and everyone sees what's going on. Right. And it's not about killing people; it's about saving everybody, and specifically saving their minds. Right. That's the only way I can see forward. And again, the CCC, which a lot of people forget about, is this is very United States centric, by the way. Everything I'm saying is so
yeah. Well, so is Facebook, so kind of
right, exactly. So the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, was something that was started during the Depression, which was one of the first massively desegregated programs in American history that taught hundreds of thousands of young men to read, black and white, got them all over the country, building highways, building dams, restoring the national parks, sending money home to the cities that the government gave them from working in the CCC. And it changed the educational dynamic during the Depression fundamentally, because you took a bunch of people who would have been itinerant, illiterate, manipulable, agitatable, and taught them to read while building essential civic infrastructure for the country. And so something similar, where we actually incentivize not just highfalutin scientists and stuff, but many, many, many people to get in on this project of building, broad national level and local to town to neighborhood level forms of civic infrastructure and participation. So, for example, in Vermont, there's this thing called the Front Porch Forum. It's gotten some good press. You can Google it.
Cool.
And you literally say, I'm Zak Stein. I live in this house. You're my neighbor there, and you're my neighbor there. And then the 100 or 200 people, right, in your town. And then you talk about what's happening in the town. Oh, there's a missing cat or whatever. And sometimes serious stuff comes up. And it's completely different tone and tenor of conversation, because you know where everybody lives and who everybody is. And you know also that you have a shared interest in the nature of the town. And so there's a lot of things that people talk about doing with regulation at a broad scale, which would come out of the woodwork naturally if we started a decentralized attempt to build an educational infrastructure. Some of the problems have been solved at local levels, but there hasn't been, as I said, this incentivization. And it can't be like a government corporate sponsored uniting to then give it to the people. It can't be that. It has to be government. Possibly corporate sponsorship across a wide array, philanthropy, giving to the people of all walks of life, possibly tied into something like basic income. I mean, there's many variables, but this is the level we have to think outside the box. It's a Manhattan Project.
Yeah, and does this relate to something which you talk about, the world philosophy? Something that really appealed to me, to be honest. Something that I think is kind of has emerged anyway because of the internet. I think social media has a philosophy built into it, codified kind of in its algorithms. And with algorithms and artificial intelligence, you build a philosophy into it. So in order to build this type of civic system, would you have to come up with a world philosophy to do it? Would it be a global thing?
I mean, if you built it right, it would be the thing that would allow an articulate world philosophy to emerge.
Yes, and you could do it that way.
It would be the infrastructure that would facilitate something like a global renaissance and enlightenment, if you forgive those terms. And there's many definitions of those that don't have to be Western-centric, but it would allow for a planetary revision of what human culture was about, and that would be a potential to broadly overlapping consensus world philosophy, right? Because when Ken Wilber tries to create an integral theory, or other people try to create a global meta theory, that's one person, right? Yeah. And it's a first, and I talk about it in the book as these are first attempts, a sense that we're at a new phase in history where we can't have these parochial nationalistic philosophies, that we need these planetary ones, but not planetary in ambition for power, but planetary in explanatory scope, if you will. And so that's very important. But I wouldn't come at it with top down and then build the thing. You have to build. Well,
that's the annoying part, isn't it? That it's you can't, if it's not a one person philosophy. It's not like some Kant can come along and write this world philosophy thing. It would have to emerge out of the facilitation of the broad spectrum conversation.
And it's not that it wouldn't be an elite conversation. It would just be an elite, basically an elite defined in terms that are not the terms of our world, if you will. So, this is the main issue, and back to the issue of teacherly authority. Right? Yes. So the idea that the elite that we've inherited, cognitive elite, political elite, economic elite, the elite that we've inherited, that's bullshit. So then you dismiss the idea of cognitive elites and political elites and economic elites in general, when in fact there are those and they exist. And anything like a world philosophy would need to find the actually existing cognitive elites that are not just the parts of our civilization who are simulating being the cognitive elite, right? Like a Steven Pinker or something.
Yeah. Do you think that's a stumbling block to this actually happening? Is the inability for us to measure that or to have any sort of like qualitative standard. Like, it's not like you can get all the people with the most views on, you know, YouTube or whatever, and they get to figure it out. Like, there's got to be, you know,
there are ways, like, if you have, so you have to, like, if we go back down to the basic context in which teacherly authority were exercised, like the home, right, the mother and the child, right, broader dynamics of community and family conversation. And you look at how those gradients of capacity and the nature of those conversations and how resolution is brought to them. That's where you have to look for the basic patterns that we're looking at. So you're not looking for upvoting in terms of popularity, but you are looking for many people vectoring towards them. That's the most rational thing I've heard.
Yeah.
Right. And so this way of like, kind of, again, slightly changing the existing tech stack to repurpose some of the metadata to upvote the most reasonable stuff, as opposed to upvoting the most hilarious or offensive or crazy stuff, right? So subtle tweaks, but again, those algorithms need to be public because we need to know why it is that. Is it actually that that's the most reasonable, or is that what the government wants me to think is the most reasonable, right? And so in order to get, we have to have the whole thing splayed open. But like, I'm not a computer guy, but if I know it's splayed open, I know computer guys. You know what I mean? So it's like there are those gradients of capacity. Not everyone's going to solve every problem, but we need to have a civic infrastructure that is robust enough that small pockets of collaboration or large, you know, meta pockets of collaboration can spontaneously emerge just as a result of people using the civic infrastructure. So right now, the attention's all vectored towards what the algorithm vectors it towards, more or less irrespective of the quality of it. But what if the stuff that was actually capturing our attention was the stuff that, you know, ought to be capturing our attention? Well, and so the ought there is a big deal, but that's the way we need to be thinking.
That is a super big deal, because one thing that I really looked into when I was first doing, because obviously monetizing attention, I don't know if you know James Williams, he wrote a book called Stand Out of Our Light. He was a Google engineer, but then became involved in applied ethics. And he's written a PhD thesis called Freedom and Persuasion in the Attention Economy, on the attention economy. But he suggested that attention, the proper functioning of attention, could be used as an ethical model for the deployment and design of new technologies. So that if you go into the structure of attention itself, how it functions, what we find salient versus voluntary effort, I've done a lot of reading on kind of the ethics of attention, that you could construct from that a better model, rather than one that takes advantage of attention, or it takes advantage of the weakness of it.
Yeah, and that's a good way to think about it. And I just am applying that also at the higher social field. So at a baseline level, I think you could look at a whole bunch of stuff from neuroscience about is your thing addictive? Is your thing Is your thing dysregulating attention? You know, is your thing, you know, on and on at that baseline level? And it's hard to define normal attention because there's a natural variability. But I think it's easy to detect pathological patterns of attention. And so that's one layer, but then a layer up there's something like the domain of personality development, and then social development, and then those dynamics of teacherly authority. So like, is your technology actually able to get people into a relationship of non-institutionalized, legitimate teacherly authority, given how we know how those things work anthropologically across all cultures and all times? Or does your thing violate those conditions and make it so any relationship in your medium is always going to be transactional and not enough trust, and one party with more information than the other manipulative, and et cetera, which means like, no, teacherly authority could almost never occur in the technology we just designed.
And it gives you kind of a way of stacking to examine the different layers, I suppose, of verification almost. Like, I was looking at attention because I felt like it was the smallest kind of unit of the issue, or that kind of the problem with social media. Like, if people are paying to capture people's attention, if they do that all of the time, we're screwed. Like, because obviously attention is necessary to solve problems. Attention is more important than knowledge, because to learn anything you have to pay attention to it. So it has this generative function that for human beings to develop, they have to pay attention. So I feel like attention and development were also kind of going like it functions by developing and it develops by functioning. So if you could create a technology that, treated attention properly, it would be also developmental properly. I don't know, that might be a bit risky, but
well, and so again, it's like that's the most basic thing I would look for is the effect of the technology on the normal workings of the human attention system. But I could imagine technology that didn't really mess with the normal workings of my attention system, that was built by an authoritarian government to basically isolate me from my parents and indoctrinate me into a new belief system about the government. Right? Like, but it would do so in a way that didn't addict me, made me interested. So I returned to it enough. And over 5 months, I consume, whatever healthy amount it would be consumed. But it would be completely inappropriate as an educational technology because all you did was factor for the non-dysregulation of attention when you actually need to also factor for. It's not you have to look at that and then also factor for things like personality development.
I was just about to touch on that as well.
And teacherly authority, specifically, what are the types of communities that are possible in these contexts? But it's a great place to start because right now that's the place to start. Like we have a whole generation that is basically brain damage.
Attention is being just
social
poured down the drain. And that also like arrested development isn't just like, oh no, you didn't kind of do the thing. That's actually damage to a person. So that if all of your attention is being flushed away and you're not developing properly, you're damaged in a sense. And that causes a lot of problems. But to come back to personality, that was another thing that I was looking at in terms of social media changing the habits that change characteristics, that change personality traits across time. Colin DeYoung, who I'm actually going to have on the podcast next month, I can't wait to talk to him. He talks about rewiring the dopaminergic system. So when you change characteristics, it changes the underlying personality trait over time. And so if the technology has that effect, would we then have to specify something like an ideal personality? I mean, would it have to encompass transformation of personality? If you could understand how that, how that could be, properly done. I feel like there's an element of that maybe in teaching where you're like, okay, you need to work on this, or this is how you progress. If you're too agreeable and you need to get a little bit more disagreeable, or you're, super extroverted, but you need to learn how to be on your own, or you're super like,
again, it's like, well, what I think we're doing here is establishing certain kind of like design parameters for healthy educational technologies. And I'm seeing what I'm identifying here are like red flags. So I'm not even talking about what ideally it would look like. What's the, because there's also the question of what is the ideal way to cultivate your attention? Like, do you need to be a goddamn Buddhist monk, or can you just be a dude who can read for 45 minutes, right? And how much variation in ADHD is a science pathological? It's just an individual difference. So there's also a normative conversation in attention. But it's, again, so I'm saying, well, let's not talk about, is it optimizing attention? Let's talk about, is it really messing with attention? Pathological diagnostics is what we're looking for. So similarly with personality, I'm not saying who you ought to be. I'm just saying, like, there are things that happen in people's personalities that they don't like, no one around them likes, that are symptomatic neuroses, which are diagnosable as a result of overuse of social media, like narcissism increasing, for example, is one. And so there I'm looking for some set of traits which obviously go up when you have poorly designed stuff, and not saying about
that's a much better way of looking at it.
It's just unhealthy, like the obsessive compulsive narcissism, and then also the identity formation in social media environments being the predominant environment of identity formation. Like, there's also just simple ratios of time spent in identity constituting conversations, and where are those taking place? And then what are the things that populate them? Is it memes that are micro-targeted to affect your identity? Or is it long form conversations with teachers and other people in your environment? So there's also just metrics there. The phrase I get from Robert Lifton is who studied re-education camps in communist China is the thought terminating cliche. Right? The thought terminating cliche.
What does that mean?
So the thought terminating cliche is in a conversation, someone says something which stops thought because of the way the phrase is used. So the one I prefer is like the science is settled. You're like, oh.
Yes. Yes. There's
that's basically a signal to me.
A huge amount of those at the moment as well, to be honest.
So thought, well, that's my point, is that one of the things that you can, one other like diagnostic category for personality development is how stereotyped is their identity and the way they understand themselves, and how many thought terminating cliches populate key places in their identity formation. And when you're in a saturated social media environment with tons of propaganda and you're in it for 7-8 hours a day, getting in arguments with people who may or may not actually be people, but actual bots, like then there's a question of, when I talk to you, like as a clinical psychologist, and I'm like, hey, tell me about your life and what do you believe and who you are and what you value, and how much of that is really clearly thought through and worked out through embodied experience and conversation, and how much am I getting that is basically a social media simulation induced thought terminating cliche based identity, right? It's the issue, and that's just a diagnostic category. And so that's the sense we have sometimes of like, what's happening, the superficiality of people's identities as a result of the basically being mostly constituted in this, again, like I said, entertainment / simulation / advertising, augmented reality world, which is what social media is. It's not a place you go to get news or talk to your friends. It's a place that's systematically augmenting your sense of what is real.
Yes, it's editing you in a certain sense to continue using the applications. But there's something that you were touching on there as well, which is the values. Something that became quite obvious to me was that the design of it kind of inculcates values in you. There's that relationship between attention and value, that you pay attention to what you value. It's a kind of prioritization between what you find salient and what you don't. And that the changing of that salience landscape also changes the values of the person that's using it. So for a generation that's grown up in social media, it's come at a time where there isn't the ethical education. This kind of ties into the other thing as well. The lack of an ethical framework makes you very vulnerable to your value system being decided by a tech company in America. And yeah, that kind of, but then I suppose this ideal educational technology system we're messing around with, so the values that inculcated, because you would gain values by using it, I suppose. Would they be? They would have to be. I mean, how could you specify those before?
Yeah, you'd want publicly articulated values that form the basis of the publicly constructed civic educational infrastructure, and you'd want one that didn't tell you what to value, but except for the ones that were kind of built in, but in terms of more specific values. Specific worldviews, religious beliefs, unique ideas about the value of relationship, friendship, pets, animals, like all of that stuff, which is to say these deep questions which people have legitimate disagreements about. What the infrastructure would need to do is not tell you what to value, would need to ensure that your values were your own, which is to say that you were protected from coercive implanting of foreign value. That you got your value through your spontaneous and autonomous conversations and learnings, rather than being micro-targeted and basically hypnotized to holding certain values. So again, it's not about over-determining the educational content. It's about setting protections and basically creating educational spaces with minimal value cooked in. Something like the value of learning, right? Like one way to talk about kind of like non-specific, non-Western definitions of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, which occur, we've got it in the Bengal Renaissance, we've got an Ethiopian Enlightenment, we've got probably an Islamic Renaissance. It depends on which historian you talk to, but the same. Right, and there's an emerging field of world history that looks at like these common patterns.
Yep.
And the common pattern isn't that it's about individualism or science. It's not that. It's actually when a culture increases its capacity to learn, and it does so intentionally. Like it says, all right, we want to, across the board, be able to learn more together about it.
But you're not specifying what has to be learned.
Specifying what? You're just increasing your overall capacity for learning and valuing the distribution of that capacity for greater learning. And so similarly, in this case, it's not about determining what that curriculum is for the future, but it's about making a commitment to increasing our capacity for learning, not our capacity to tell people what to think.
Yeah,
which is what's
plenty.
Which is what you could do. You could repurpose this as a tool to just basically you could basically sell the nudge machine to just one client.
But then you've kind of just done it, in trying to undo the thing, you've kind of just done it.
Right, but the point is that some people think education is just telling people what to think. I'm saying education is actually creating conditions where learning can take place. And an educational institution is an institution that has a commitment to that, first and foremost, before, quote unquote, indoctrinating anyone into any specific ideas. Yeah. You need to make sure that they're equipped and the people around them and the environment is equipped, that learning can take place, which means mistakes happen, which means disagreements get worked out and not kind of weaponized. And there's a whole bunch of other factors that allow learning to take place and that demonstrate a commitment to learning as opposed to a commitment of conformity. The commitment to learning is the basis of, I think, a feasible open society. So that's
really interesting that everybody I'm thinking of this kind of warrior scholars thing, but it's a big thing in ninjutsu and that kind of framework of weird guys. Like, I don't know if you know Miyamoto Musashi and those kind of, he's an old Bushido guy, but that they had this kind of warrior philosophy, but that the warrior philosophy was also of being a lifelong learner. Like a lot of them were kind of also sculptors and painters and did these different things. And it was kind of the path of discipline actually made you, in a sense, to desire that kind of constant, not that you had to, there was a specific thing you had to learn, but more that the learning was to be a constant kind of practice. Of continuous development. And so, it might be more motivational in that sense, maybe. Does that?
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's also just like it's a pretty universal ideal that we can hold about societies. Yep. That they would want to open themselves to more learning and not be closed to learning. It's a kind of a very broad definition where there's a lot of pluralism that can take place in there. Yep. As long as the commitment to learning it's not about weaving a simulation and then you learn about the simulation. Learning is reality dependent. So learning is a commitment to relate to reality together as a society. Learning. So that's very valuable. That same idea can be used as a very general way to think about identity development and personality development. And so this warrior ethos of lifelong learning, it's actually a commitment to be continually in touch with reality.
Yeah, and that's the Socrates thing as well. I mean, the whole, knowing that you know nothing, it's not that. It's kind of more of a statement of that I'm continually pursuing truth rather than staying fixed with what I've already got.
Yeah. And if you've experienced it, which is to say, if you've done deep learning in one domain, like in the martial art, then you can generalize that skill of relating to reality. And so that's what makes, some domains of learning so powerful. And that's what could make a civic infrastructure minimally skeletally powerful because you could focus on the capacity for learning or upgrading capacity for learning.
That is brilliant. That it could be scalable in the sense that if people were given that capacity, they would generalize themselves to more learning.
That's the idea. That the best teacher, what's the saying? Like, you don't give a man a fish, you give him a fishing pole and teach him how to fish. So, the best teacher doesn't make you dependent upon their teacherly authority. They want to obsolete that as quickly and reasonably as they can. And then, even more so, they would want to equip you to be able to learn more after you've interacted with them. So I think, John Dewey said something to that effect, that good learning, because good learning opens up the possibility for more future learning, right? Nice. There are some forms of learning, like if you learn a thought-terminating cliche, that cuts off the possibility of future learning. But you learned it, but now you've cut off the possibility of future learning because you use it like a thought terminating cliche. Whereas in other domains, it's clear that, you learn, and then that, in fact, you're learning when more vistas open up.
Yeah, that's certainly
having read that book. Now I know how much I don't know.
Yes, that's definitely a phenomenon. I had that when I started learning about epigenetics, and I just realized that I knew absolutely nothing. I'd completely wasted all of my time, and that's it. Really, wow. There's so much to digest there and so much to think about. But yeah. Thank you, Zach. I think that's a good place to put a pin in it. And I'm going to keep learning now. I think that's the message I'll take away.
Me too. Me too.
Just pause.